Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do very, very much appreciate you being with me. We are continuing our study on the challenge of Christ. We've covered an awful lot of territory. But I've been sharing with you, not only did Jesus issue a challenge concerning his word and the work that the Father gave him in regard to his second coming. Now remember, the challenge of Christ is this: do not believe me for my word's sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works that my Father has given me, do not believe me. That's John 10:37 and following. Now, certainly there are many things that the Father gave Jesus to do, right? He gave them the work. He gave him the work to come and to suffer, to die, and to be resurrected. We've talked about that at length. And we've demonstrated that, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if Christ is not risen, your faith is in vain. In other words, Jesus said, the Father gave me the work to come, to die, and to be raised from the dead. And if I'm not raised from the dead, then your faith is in vain. Christianity is a sham. So the challenge is severe. The challenge is powerful. The challenge is important. But it wasn't just his resurrection that was a work that the Father gave him. The Father gave him the work, as he stated, Matthew 16:27 and 28, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here, that was 2,000 years ago, that shall not taste of death. They won't die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Coming of the Son of Man, verse 27, coming of the Son of Man, verse 28. Coming of the man to judge and to reward, coming of the Son of Man and his kingdom. The coming of the Son of Man and his kingdom is the time of the judgment and the reward. Matthew chapter 25:31 and following. So, we have this incredible challenge in front of us, ladies and gentlemen, that the church historically has really, genuinely, truly struggled with. You know, I'm from time to time, I am absolutely flabbergasted at the desperation of commentators, I'll use that term very, very loosely, who try to argue away the reality of all of these New Testament time statements concerning the appearing of Christ. Just recently on Facebook, a former preterist, a man that used to once proclaim the truth, that God kept his word, Christ kept his word, the apostles were true. Anyway, he goes to James chapter 5, where James, writing to Christians, says, and by the way, they're in the midst of persecution. And he says, be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Well, James uses the Greek word hios for until. That means, brethren, be patient, literally, until the Lord comes. That's the way 100% of the Bible translations render it. That's the way that historically in the church fathers, and the reason I mention that is because this individual says he's in lockstep with the early church fathers. Well, that's a bold-faced falsehood. Because this individual now comes up and says, well, James actually said the parousia has drawn near, and it's in the perfect tense, which means it was already there. So he rejects the united 100% testimony of the early church fathers, of the creeds, when the creeds do mention James 5, and the commentators. You know, I've been going through my commentaries here, and I've got tons of commentaries over there. Been going through them on James, trying to find anyone that renders James chapter 5 like this guy does. any commentary whatsoever that comes even remotely close to agreeing with the position that this guy set forth. I have not found even one that hinted, that suggested, that said it might possibly be a possibility. No, not one. When I pointed that out on Facebook, that here he is, a guy who claims to be in lockstep with scholarship, who claims to be in full agreement with the creeds, who claims to be in agreement with the church fathers, yet he's setting forth a view here that cannot be found in the church fathers, in the creeds, or in the commentators. All of a sudden he changed the subject. Totally changed the subject. Well, that's typical. That's what you call an argumentum ad desperatum. As I've shared with you before, the argumentum ad desperatum is a non-Latin term that I personally invented. Okay, it's not in the Greek, not in the Latin, but I invented that term to describe so many people just like this guy who literally invent out of thin air, by an abuse of the Greek, by a perversion of the Greek, by a perversion of the context. They come up with these brand spanking new arguments that are unknown in history, and they say, see, here's the truth of what that passage says. And by the way, I agree with the early church. When in reality, that's just a bold-faced falsehood. He made it up out of thin air. So, to move on, the early church, the historical church, and the present church continues to struggle with the challenge of Christ in regard to the second coming of Christ and what Jesus had to say about the time of his appearing. The New Testament is clear, ladies and gentlemen. It cannot be denied. Jesus and his apostles said he was coming back in the first century. His coming was at hand. It was coming soon. It was coming shortly and quickly. I'm sorry. The only way that you can deny that is to pervert the Greek text. And to deny and to distort and to pervert church history, the creeds, and the commentators. It's the only way you can come to that conclusion. But that's not the only challenge of Christ, you see. Over the last few weeks, I've been sharing with you the challenge of Christ in regard to his first coming. And I have been comparing what Jesus said about his first coming, what the Old Testament said about his first coming. Now look, the historical church essentially says Christ failed his own challenge because he said he was coming back in the first century, in the lifetime of that generation. He did not do it, therefore his own challenge failed. And as I pointed out, the skeptics, the atheists, the Jews, the Muslims, they all know what he said. They know that if one maintains the view that the coming of the Lord is an earth-burning, cosmos-destroying, time-ending event when Jesus comes out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man, they know Jesus failed his own prediction. Listen, these commentaries behind me, written by some of the finest Greek scholars in all the world, they know what the Greek means. They know that what Jesus predicted. But guess what? They believe he was predicting that he was coming back as that 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body in that generation. They know it didn't happen, and therefore they say, well, this was an embarrassment to the early church. Because he obviously didn't come. C.S. Lewis, a very, very, very noted Christian commentator, philosopher, if you please, from the 20th century, commenting on Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 34 says, it must be admitted, and I'm paraphrasing here, it must be admitted that these are some of the most embarrassing words to be found on the lips of Jesus, because everyone knows he did not come back in that generation. And he said the church must confront this reality. And C.S. Lewis essentially was crying out for some help, knowing if we take the traditional view of the coming of the Lord and we try to fit it into the first century generation, we are forced to the conclusion that Jesus' challenge failed. But again, you see, that's not the only challenge. The rest of Jesus' challenge has to do with the fact that in his personal ministry, he came to establish the kingdom. He came to be king. And I've shared with you this statement. And you know, it's really interesting in the comment section on my YouTube as my programs are now aired on YouTube. I have had several individuals make the comment, wow, I've never seen that. What have they not seen? Here it is. Please catch the power of this. The Jews never rejected Jesus' offer of the kingdom and to be king until Jesus first rejected their offer to make him king over the kingdom. Folks, do you see that? Remember John 6:15. After Jesus had just fed the 5,000 men with just a few loaves and a few fishes, Jesus perceived they were about to come and make him king. He withdrew himself. You see, he rejected their offer of the kingdom and the kingship. And so we've been posing the question and exploring the question, why did Jesus reject the Jewish offer of the kingdom? I mean, there it was. The offer was, as it were, on a golden platter. So why did he turn it down if he came to be the kind of king they wanted, if he came to establish the kind of kingdom they wanted, and they're supposedly, ostensibly offering it to him, why did he turn it down? Let me remind you that in my formal public debate with Dr. Joel McDermott in 2012 at the Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, and the debate is available on DVD form or an MP3, either one. You can go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Just go to the store, look up the McDermott-Preston debate, and you can order that. And you'll be absolutely amazed. And I made the point in response to Dr. McDermott's claim, Jesus came to establish an earthly, nationalistic, physical kingdom. When he was asked if that was the kind of kingdom Jesus wanted in the Q&A session, he said, yes, that's exactly what Jesus wanted. When I got up and posed the reality of John chapter 6, verse 15, he got up and said that, and I asked him, if what you're saying is true, then why did Jesus reject their offer of the kingdom? He got up and said the reason Jesus rejected that offer was because, quote, the time was not right. Can you believe that? John the Baptizer said the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. So evidently John thought the time was right. Jesus, in Mark 1:15, Matthew 4:17, Jesus said, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven has drawn near. So evidently Jesus thought the time was right for the coming of the kingdom. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when we try to impose a nationalistic, militaristic, geopolitical theocracy concept onto the kingdom that Jesus came to establish, then we are guilty, essentially, of trying to offer Jesus the very kind of kingdom that he turned down. And we are offering him the kind of kingdom the Jews wanted, and thus the kind of kingdom they offered him. And remember, once again, he turned that down. And so the question is, the question that we've been answering over the last couple of weeks, why did Jesus refuse the offer of the kingdom? I've taken you to Judges chapter 8. And the story of Gideon defeating the Midianites, of Zimah and Zalmunna, the kings of the Midianites. And as a result of that victory, the children of Israel came to Gideon and said, "We want you and your sons and your grandsons to rule over us." And Gideon said, "No, I will not rule over you. My sons won't rule over you. But the Lord God, who delivered you from the land of Egypt, he shall rule over you." What was Gideon doing? He was doing exactly what Jesus did in John 6:15. Do you catch the power of that? Here are the Jews offering a nationalistic, militaristic, geopolitical theocracy, kingship to Gideon, and Gideon said, "No." Here's Jesus in John chapter 6, and the Jews are offering him to be the king over the very kind of king that their predecessors offered Gideon, and Jesus said, "No." And then we came to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel was the judge over Israel. He was growing old, and he appointed his sons to be judges, but his sons were depraved, they were dishonest, they were profligate. They began perverting the justice of the land, and therefore the children of Israel came to Samuel and said, "Samuel, your sons are dishonest, they're depraved, they're perverting justice. Therefore, make us a king to rule over us, that we might be like the other nations." What were they doing? They were doing exactly what they did in the story of Judges, chapter 8. They were doing what they would do centuries upon centuries later when their ancestors, or their descendants rather, would offer Jesus the kingdom. Now Samuel was extremely grieved. Why was he extremely grieved? Because Samuel knew. You see, Deuteronomy had predicted all of this. Deuteronomy had said that the time was going to come in which Israel would desire a king, and they would have a king, but they would regret having a king. The taxation would be tremendous. The injustice would be incredible. Oh, but they didn't pay attention. They still wanted a king. So Samuel, in all of his grief, the Lord spoke to Samuel and said, "Samuel, don't grieve. That's up to me. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me." Now, listen, folks, you absolutely must catch the poignancy and the power of what's happening here. Remember, do not lose sight of the fact that what was happening in 1 Samuel chapter 8 is precisely what was happening in John chapter 6. The Jews want a national, physical, earthly king over their kingdom. God said, they have not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. So God, it's kind of interesting that in Matthew chapter 19, the Lord spoke of Israel and their attitude toward divorce and what have you. And he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart. Well, here's another example of the hardness of the heart of Israel. The Lord said to Israel through Samuel that they were sinning in desiring a king to sit on a physical throne, ruling them as a nationalistic king so that they could be like the other nations. And when they were confronted with their sin, they were basically like, okay, but give us a king anyway. Now I want you to go with me to 1 Samuel chapter 10. When the Lord said something, or when what the Lord said was repeated 3 different times, maybe, just maybe, we ought to set up and take notice. Well, the Lord instructed Samuel and told him, I have anointed, or I have chosen Saul to be the king. Now look, the Lord knew exactly what that was going to cause. The Lord knew the abuses that were going to take place under Saul. But remember, because of the hardness of Israel's heart, he was going to allow it. He had already predicted it, so he's going to allow it. And so, in 1 Samuel chapter 10, the Lord sent Samuel to Saul, and he told Samuel to tell Saul, you have been chosen king, to be king over Israel. And Saul was like, say what? What? He was kind of a simple shepherd himself, simple man. And Samuel prophesied. Saul prophesied when the Spirit came on him. That's 1 Samuel chapter 10. And in verse 17 and following, I'm just going to read it, and I've got to hurry here. Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah and said to the children of Israel, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all kingdoms and from those who oppressed you. But you, now watch this, you've got to catch this. But you have rejected your God, who himself saved you from all your adversities and your tribulations, and you have said to him, no, set a king over us. Now therefore, present yourselves by your tribes and by your clans. So, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Israel said they wanted a king, the Lord said, they've not rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me. Okay? The desire for a physical king on a physical throne was a rejection of Yahweh's kingship. 1 Samuel chapter 10, the Lord proceeds and allows Israel to have a king. He anoints Saul to be king. He gathers Israel together and says, okay guys, I got to tell you, you've made your choice, but here's an opportunity for you. You might want to rethink. Remember what I've done for you. I myself, I delivered you. You didn't have to have a king. Remember? I delivered you out of Egypt. I'm the one that has delivered you. But you said, no, it's not enough. So, okay. All right. I'm going to give you a king. So everybody needs to come together on a given time, on a given date, and I'll give you your king. So in 1 Samuel chapter 11 and into chapter 12, we find some early exploits of Saul that enamored the children of Israel with him. And in 1 Samuel, what do we find? Once again, Samuel gathers the children of Israel. They are there at Mizpah. They are there to see their king. They've been fascinated by the exploits of Saul. And so, watch this. 1 Samuel chapter 12, 17 and following. Is today not the wheat harvest? Samuel said, I will call to the Lord. He will send thunder and rain, and you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for a king for yourselves. Now, why did Samuel say, today's the day of harvest, but guess what? I'm going to pray to the Lord. I'm going to pray to the Lord for thunder and rain. Listen, folks, that would have ruined the harvest. That would have meant famine was coming. This is basically a threat of death. So Samuel reminds them that what they have requested is a sin. Now watch, got to hurry here. So Samuel called the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. The people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of asking a king for ourselves. I'm out of time. See you next week.